Iran denounces a UN probe into the suppression of protests. Tehran has rejected a fact-finding mission to investigate potential abuses, claiming it's a political committee. Meanwhile, demonstrators continue calling for freedom and reform in the country. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Iran. Well, Iran says it will not cooperate in any way with the United Nations investigation into alleged human rights violations, rejecting it outright as political. After weeks of anti-government protests across the country, punctuated by police crackdowns and arrests, the UNHCR voted to create an independent fact-finding mission to investigate alleged abuses. Germany and Iceland submitted the resolution, and 25 members backed it. But 6 others, Armenia, China, Cuba, Eritrea, Pakistan, and Venezuela, opposed it, while 16 abstained. In response, Iran announced its own local fact-finding mission comprised of representatives from the judiciary, the parliament, and others. In the meantime, however, Tehran has shown no sign of relaxing its hard-line suppression of dissent. Let's take a look at how the last 2 months brought Iran to this point.
It's been 2 months since 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in police custody after the morality police arrested her for wearing her hijab incorrectly. Her death sparked protests that have taken the country by storm. What started with women ripping off their headscarves in solidarity turned into a revolt against the Islamic Republic itself. And Tehran's response was force. More than 300 people have been killed in the unrest, and it's believed thousands have been injured and many more arrested.
From what we could gather, around 14,000 people, including children, have so far been arrested in the context of these protests. This is a staggering number. I'm alarmed by reports that even children suspected of having participated in protests are being arrested at school.
The Iranian regime is facing one of its biggest challenges since the 1979 revolution. This month, Tehran sentenced 5 detainees to death. Another 21 could be facing the same fate. Last week, the UN Human Rights Council voted to condemn the crackdown.
The United Nations were founded to protect the sovereignty of every state. But a regime that uses this power to violate the rights of its own people is violating the values of our United Nations.
But Iran says it will not cooperate with a UN probe into possible human rights violations.
The Islamic Republic of Iran, as it said officially, will have no cooperation whatsoever with this political committee that has been called a fact-finding committee.
Tehran has repeatedly blamed foreign enemies for the protests and even accuses terrorists of killing several dozen security force members.
The problem is not a few rioters in the street. Even if each rioter, each terrorist must be punished, the battlefield is much broader. The main enemy is the global arrogance.
Meanwhile, the protests continue unabated.
Well, a number of high-profile figures have been detained after voicing their support for the protests. Actors, activists, footballers, and politicians have all faced the wrath of the regime. But the detentions don't seem to be stopping people from speaking out.
Last week, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei's niece, Farideh Moratani, released a video statement calling her uncle's authorities murderous and child-killing. The video was posted online 2 days after the activist was arrested. In her statement, she called on foreign countries to cut ties with the regime.
I ask all conscientious people of the world to stand by us and ask their governments not to react with empty words and slogans, but with real action, and stop any dealing with this regime.
Dissident rapper Tumash Salehi also has spoken out against the Islamic Republic. When protests began in September, Toumaj released several songs criticizing the government and praising the bravery of the Iranian people. Just days after posting that video, Toumaj was arrested by security forces. He faces a charge of corruption on earth, which comes with a possible death sentence. Human rights groups say Toumaj's life is at serious risk. And the Iranian football team turned the World Cup in Qatar into a global political stage.
Iran, well, they were brave throughout this competition, but they go home empty-handed. But they will be remembered for their protest on the field.
The Iranian players refused to sing the country's national anthem in their opening game against England to show solidarity with the protesters back home. Tehran then gave the players a warning, saying they'll face retribution for insulting the anthem and flag. But fans took up the cause, carrying signs and wearing T-shirts to show their support for the protesters rising against the regime.
So as the protests continue, so does the retribution. And without an objective investigation into accountability, what will happen to Iran's protest movement? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Tehran, Setareh Sadeqi. She is a political analyst and researcher at the University of Tehran. In Istanbul is Borzou Daragahi. He is an international correspondent for The Independent and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And in Berlin, Ali Fathollah-Nejad, an associate fellow with the American University of Beirut's Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, it really would have been shocking if Iran had allowed this UN investigation to go forward. But still, Ali, I'll start with you. Who loses when this sort of investigation is not done? What will not be exposed or revealed or accounted for?
Well, obviously, as you suggested earlier, it's all about accountability of crimes committed by the security apparatus against peaceful protesters in Iran since mid-September. But I think this UN Human Rights Council investigation mission that is planned now is very important because it's going to shed light on those issues, and it's going to pave the way for a criminal investigation also of those responsible in the crackdown, also outside of the country and internationally. So this is quite an important step.
Okay, Setareh, I'd like to get your feelings on such an investigation. I mean, obviously, Tehran says that anything conducted by the UN would be far too political to be reliable. So Tehran has suggested a local fact-finding commission. I mean, what do you think would actually provide the most transparent and honest investigation into human rights abuses that we know have taken place?
Well, I think it was pretty much expected that Iran would not allow a UN so-called fact-finding commission into the country because Iran has an experience, and the global South in general has an experience of how politicized every decision coming from the UN with regards to the observation of human rights has been. And even just the designation of a special rapporteur on the status of human rights in Iran by the United Nations has been politicized and criticized by not only Iran but other independent countries as well. The special UN rapporteur does not even care to do a simple, Google search to find out that, for example, Kurdish names are allowed in Iran, and over 5,000 people are named, like girls in Iran are named Gina, and he claims that Kurdish names are forbidden in Iran. So that's how it seems like it's not the facts that are important, but what can be used against Iran. Now, Iran has also had started, even before this move, which was actually engineered by Germany, which is a country that Iranians do not really have a good experience with, because Germany is also known for how they supported Saddam and provided Saddam's regime with chemical weapons to use against Iranian citizens. So this seems to be totally politicized, and I think it makes the struggles of, for example, NGOs and independent entities inside Iran even more difficult, because it looks like it is not human rights observation that is important inside Iran. It's actually, as I said, just standing against any country that wants to just stand against the U.S. imperialism. And the UN has basically become a tool for maintaining U.S. hegemony. Like, how can MBS get immunity from the United States and just nobody cares about how human rights are violated in Saudi Arabia and women's rights are violated?
Feels there's some hypocrisy and double standards, but Borzou, go ahead. I could see you had a comment.
I think that Iran is an extremely autocratic dictatorship, and as such, there is absolutely no chance for any kind of accountability. The security forces have free reign and have been just pummeling the people. I think
and Saudi Arabia is a democracy?
Hey, we let you speak, okay? I think the fact that the regime only allows people like Ms. Sadeqi to go on television and get into the studio in this particular way is a testament. If anyone else who came on in a television station or even on Skype and gave a view that was counter Ms. Sadeqi's, she would be thrown into Evin prison within hours, if not just a day or two. So I think that there is absolutely no chance for accountability or transparency from within the regime. I can basically, in Ms. Sadeqi's voice, I can hear the voice of Mohammad Marandi and other people close to the supreme leader.
Ali, you go ahead. I can see you've been wanting to jump in.
No, I mean, obviously, Borzou is quite right. There is no rule of law in Iran, and it has nothing to do with, Saudi Arabia or... and the truth of the matter is that, unfortunately, Setareh was, picking up a lot of regime propaganda points. And might just respond to her point on Iran and a politicized decision and also the issue of the global South. And it is important to remember that human rights are universal values. And this is, I think, increasingly understood by more countries in the world looking at the human rights violations by the Islamic Republic. And this is also quite an important point because it focuses international attention on the nature of the regime in Iran, and which is cracking down on the people. So there is no need to whataboutism here. The facts are clear.
Okay, Setareh, let me come back to you, because if we look at what Iran's leadership is actually focusing on now in attributing what is actually fueling these protests, the leadership continues to blame so much of the unrest, which you yourself has said in many ways is organic and legitimate. They continue to blame this constantly on Western powers and foreign meddling. And now you seem to also agree, even though initially you did say that this was the legitimate grievances of your fellow Iranians. You've even accused them as the foreign powers of arming insurgencies. Try to help us understand how you don't think that the Iranians themselves are fully responsible for the protests we're seeing across the country, that this is someone else to blame from the outside.
Yeah. Well, since day one that the protests started, and I was very sympathetic to these protesters, I said that these protests are actually truly legitimate, and they started over a very, very legitimate cause that are shared by human values across the world. And when I say that, when I talk about double standards by the UN or the US, it does not mean that human rights are not violated in Iran. They are just like any other countries, and actually to a lesser extent. But the thing is how these human rights violations are treated and politicized. So it shows to me as an Iranian citizen and a scholar that it's not human rights that these people and the UN is caring about. It's about politicizing human rights to use against Iran. And I have also worked with NGOs. I have represented NGOs at the UN with UNESCO and United Nations consulting status. And I know how these politicizations make our struggle to work for more observation of human rights inside Iran more difficult. So you're not helping us. You're just making everything more difficult.
Okay, and as for Setareh, help us understand what would actually change in Iran if the UN were not involved, if there were no outside forces involved. What would change in Iran?
Just get their hands. It's for the UN and the US to just get their hands off Iran
and then what?
Stop following a
would
regime
Ayatollah
change
Ali
inside
Khamenei
Iran.
allow
Iranians
for the
do not need
reform
any
that
help
these
from outside.
protesters
Let
are
me
calling
finish.
For?
Iranians don't want a UN to tell them what is right or what is wrong. We know and we share human rights. The Iranian culture is very welcoming to improvement of, for example, women's rights. As a woman, I have been fighting for more even rights, but we have been improving over years, and we want to keep that without allowing any foreign interventions. John Bolton proudly says that they have been able at this time to get or deliver arms to the rioters, either by attacking security forces and the IRGC forces and like confiscating arms from them, or by Kurdish separatist agents that work inside Iran. So I think this is very telling. You don't have to wait for the UN to tell you, or for the Iranians leader
but I still was asking,
tell you if there is an intervention. John Bolton is telling you.
But aside
just
from
look at CNN or BBC or I don't know, all those mainstream media and how they don't care about facts.
Okay. Borzou, go ahead. I can see you've been wanting a
yeah,
turn.
but
go ahead.
You can just go to Khamenei.ir and go to the English section, and you can get these talking points. Look, the bottom line is this UN investigation came because the Iranian regime for 44 years has pushed the most intelligent, the brightest, the most talented, the most gifted, the most independent-minded people of the Iranian nation out of the country into the diaspora, where they have become incredible successes. And they're the ones, if you want to know who's behind the UN investigation, who's behind Germany going after the Iranian regime, who's behind the US taking a harder line against the Iranian regime, who's behind Canada taking a harder line around the regime. Take a look at Tehran's policy towards people who are dissidents, pushing them out of the country. They go into the diaspora, they go into politics, they go into academia, they become very influential, and they become smart. So basically, it's the people in the diaspora that have been pushing for this. If to the extent that this is a politicization of human rights, it's because of Iran's own policies and its own treatment of its own people who have gone abroad and pushed their governments, their adopted governments, to take a very, very tough line against the regime.
Okay, Ali, I want to put to you the question I was putting to Setareh. I mean, if there were no foreign elements involved, I mean, I know that's almost impossible, but still, if there were no UN push for an investigation, if the US couldn't say that, if Iran couldn't say that the US has played some nefarious role in all of this, do you think there would be reform in Tehran? Would they be hearing as even Setareh said, the legitimate grievances of many of these protesters to change rights for women in the country, for example? Do you think there would be serious reform in Iran?
Well, honestly, first of all, I think it's quite clear that also given past experiences with so-called reformist or moderate governments in Iran, that the path to reform in the Islamic Republic of Iran has been closed, and this is not a new development. It has been realized among many sections of Iranian society over the last 10 years. Hence, this revolutionary process that is going on, hence calls for regime change by Iranians inside of the country. So this is quite clear, the connection between the unreformability of the system and calls for radical change. Also the reaction from Iran shows how nervous the Islamic Republic has become because of this UN investigation. They're very nervous because they know it's something substantial as opposed to the sanctions that have been imposed, for instance, by the European Union just a few weeks prior to that. And this step is quite important because it sheds light on the grave human rights violations by the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is nothing new, as Borzou has suggested, and which is on full display to the world over. So this is probably a very important point at which a great section of the international community has started to understand the nature of the regime, because the regime does not offer reforms to the people. but it prefers to kill them, and it prefers to crack down on them. And this is a major issue that is of concern not only to Iranians but also to the international community.
Setareh, I have to ask you this. As an Iranian woman yourself, when you see Ayatollah Khamenei's niece, Farideh Moradkhani, now asking foreign governments not to do business with the regime, she says, effectively saying, Iran has to be even further isolated to try and have any effect on the regime in Tehran to bring about any reform. What kind of person is she to a woman like yourself? Is there respect for a voice like that so close to the Ayatollah, or no? Do people dismiss her out of hand, saying she's also a foreign agent of sorts?
As an Iranian woman, I can just see how things have improved over the last 43 years for Iran. And it's not enough for us. We have been struggling and we have been fighting for our rights. And we, just like women across the world, we want to try and do our best to get more of our rights and demand from the government to allow more space for women to practice their rights. And this has been happening, although very, very slow, because of foreign interventions, actually. And this is not what I say. This is what I hear from my fellow female scholars and activists and students that I talk to, that they don't want any foreign intervention. We don't need foreign intervention. This is like, it reminds us very much of what the UN and US pursued in, and NATO pursued in Libya and in Syria and in other places. So
ask you very
this is, I mean, if they allow Iranian women inside Iran,
Dr. Sadeqi, what do you think?
Let me finish. If they allow Iranians inside Iran to independently follow what they want, human rights will improve a lot more.
Setareh, I apologize. Borzou, ask your question. Your audio continues to drop.
What do you think of the Supreme Leader's own niece saying that basically there is no hope for reform in Iran, that Iran needs to be isolated, that embassies need to be shut down, that there is no reform, only regime change? What do you say to that? Who is she? Is she also a foreign agent?
Who called for the closure of
The niece of the Supreme Leader.
Who called for the closure of U.S. embassies?
Of Iranian embassies.
I'm not here, I mean, I don't hear very well from the, both.
Sorry,
who called for the closure of the U.S. embassy, of Iran embassies across the world? Who called for that?
Supreme Leader's own niece.
You tell me, who called for that?
Setareh, yeah, if you
it's very easy for me to also say that you sound like Iran International, the Saudi fund that.
Okay, sure.
Okay, if you don't want to answer the question, you can tell me you don't want to answer it. If it's clear, if you don't have an opinion on her, you can say as much. But I would be.
Can't say anything negative about Supreme Leader. That's why. She's not allowed.
Okay.
She's in Tehran.
Let me come to Ali then. Ali, if
I didn't understand your question, but if you're asking me,
I had asked you very clearly about
what did you ask about the Supreme Leader? Of course, I'm not here to.
Your opinion about the Supreme Leader's niece and the statements that she has very clearly made about the regime.
I'm not here to say what I think of the Supreme Leader's comments, although I have a lot of respect for him as someone who is widely very popular with still a lot of people. And Iran is a legitimate political entity. And this is not what I say. This is what the people have showed the world by taking part in elections and being actively a part of this society. And sometimes with a lower turnout to show that they're not happy with things. So, yeah, I mean, it's
I'll tell you what, we just have a minute left.
Easy to start.
Borzou, you can have some final thoughts then. I mean, where do you think this is actually going? It doesn't seem like there's any light at the end of the tunnel at this point, if I can express my observation. Go ahead.
The war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria, which is a client of the Iranian regime, were also the subject of many investigations. And that has yielded a lot of answers about what the regime did there. And has led to investigations and even prosecutions of people. Here's hoping that this UN investigation will open the doors to some prosecutions of regime figures and their relatives and sons and daughters as well.
Why do you think there is no UN commission to probe the crimes of Saudi Arabia?
Again, we know it's political, but I wanted to really.
Do you think the status of human rights and women's rights is better in Saudi Arabia?
Okay.
Emphasizing Saudi Arabia.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So suddenly we're okay.
I'll tell you what, that's going to have to be very unfortunately.
I don't have to emphasize the double standards by the US or the UN. I think that's very clear for
Okay, Setareh,
your
yes,
audience.
we had your point. Thank you so much, really, all three of my panelists for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. I am sure we will be continuing this discussion at some point, again, in the very near future. But in the meantime, thanks to our viewers as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.